Abbie, super happy to have you on the pod. When we last chatted and when we were preparing for this podcast, I realized you'd be the perfect first guest because you're a super, very welcoming, very warm personality, and you're very genuine with your thoughts. So, welcome to the pod.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here and to chat about all things VC and platform.
Amazing. So, just so we can get the audience as excited as I am to have you on the pod, tell us a little bit about who you are, what you're working on.
Yeah, well, hi audience. I'm Abbie Strabala. I'm an associate at True Wealth Ventures. At True Wealth, we do seed stage investing in women-led companies improving human or environmental health. And I think we'll go down and talk about that a little bit more. Who I am, I'm based in San Francisco. I started investing kind of right at the start of the pandemic, so a hype cycle investor. And, it's been an interesting ride of kind of navigating what this career looks like long term. Venture is an interesting industry of there aren't really clear linear paths for career growth. So figuring it out, kind of building the engine as you drive is the name of the game.
Yeah, I think when I first got in touch with you, Abbie, one of the reasons I was super interested in what you're doing, I feel that you've been very committed to the cause of helping female entrepreneurs and LGBTQ plus entrepreneurs from a super, super early stage in your career, right? And it's stayed consistent throughout. So what got me thinking, what's your why? And what drove you to care so much about these causes that today you're doing so much to support them? Very curious.
I think my mom, she gets a lot of credit. My mom was always, she's a stay-at-home mom and just always involved in philanthropy and volunteer work. And she was, I'm the black sheep of my family that doesn't work for the U.S. government. And so, I think that she just instilled this need of like, whatever you do in life, it has to be mission aligned. Like you have to believe in what you're doing. And I think I really carried that throughout my career. I started in nonprofits here in San Francisco in the advocacy space for LGBTQ plus kind of civil rights and nonprofits. And then, as I was trying to figure out like, what do I want to do with my life? What problems do I want to solve? I wanted to make money because San Francisco is expensive and nonprofits don't pay a lot. So I knew that I wanted something in the private sector, but I didn't want to lose that mission alignment and that passion for what you do. So then I kind of got exposed to impact investing and actually found my way into venture via contraception, which, I was on my own personal exploration of a woman in her 20s in California, figuring out what method to use, what's going to work the best for my body and for my lifestyle, and found that there was actually really little innovation happening in that space, despite the fact that it had been over 20 years since a new type of contraceptive had hit the market. Like there wasn't a lot of innovation. So that's what kind of got me into investing, as I found an organization that was paying attention to a space that nobody else was in women's health, really focused on contraceptive innovation and maternal health, which was Rhea Ventures, at the time a nonprofit, working with foundations to align their endowments with their missions and their programmatic investing, which turned into a venture fund, a $40 million venture fund called RH Capital, investing exclusively in women's health. So that was kind of my pathway here. And then as you're in venture, as a woman, the industry is 80% men. And then you look at the funding that goes to founders, and overwhelmingly, 70+% of the funding in the industry goes to all male teams. And so, if you follow the numbers long enough, it's really not that much of a surprise that the types of innovations getting VC funding and seeing that kind of mass commercialization aren't necessarily solving the problems for 51% of the population.
Yeah, that actually blows my mind, Abbie, and I truly mean that because, so obviously as a male, I don't see that perspective. I never even thought about it, and hearing that women make 80% of consumer purchases and healthcare decisions, where exactly in the startup ecosystem then are they most prevalent versus not? And when I looked at True Wealth Ventures, where you're working now, it's very fascinating to see that you're supporting female entrepreneurs and that's your core focus. It's truly a very daunting statistic that 80% of decisions are made by them, yet they're not the ones cutting the checks most of the time, right? And another fact, which again, just I'm still observing, is that most of the funding goes to all male teams. And again, being very candid, as a man, when I see that, when you tell me the stat, I go, oh, really? But when I see a startup team with like a full tech team, product team, everyone's a guy, I look at that and I say, oh yeah, that's normal because that's what I'm used to, right? So it's very interesting. I'm kind of having a bit of a cognitive dissonance right now. So yeah, thank you for bringing that statistic to light. And speaking of VC, Abbie, my understanding is you've been both on the investment side of a venture capital firm as well as the platform side, right? And being in emerging funds, my understanding is from our last conversation that there's not much of key differences between the two because technically everyone's doing everything. But kind of curious that, in your eyes, Abbie, what's unique about the investment role and the platform role? And if there's an up-and-coming VC associate listening to this pod now, what advice would you have for her to kind of thrive in these individual roles? Because I think you have some good insights there.
Yeah, so I've spent my whole career kind of at these emerging funds, less than 100 million in assets under management, really small teams. My current team is 3. When I joined RH Capital, there were 3 of us, grew to 5. So, in terms of how I think about platform, I think of platform as like the catch-all phrase for non-investment roles. Mm-hmm. And at emerging firms, and, just in my experience, at a small firm, you don't have the capital to hire a platform person. That's just not in your 2% management fee budget on a small fund. It just, the math doesn't work. Yeah. So what ends up happening is everybody does everything. So what I learned really early on in my career, I kind of started in finance and ops and just built out the infrastructure of a fund. Like, what does it take to run a fund? How do you get LPs to give you money to invest in a fund? What kind of infrastructure should you be thinking about? How do you run an audit? In addition to some of those traditional platform pieces that I think mostly people talk about in terms of portfolio support, right? Which to me is a whole other bucket of platform, of like that marketing support, that like fractional CFO. We've seen other firms kind of start to pull together like mental health resources and different things. And I think from the firm perspective, it's important to recognize as a firm where your value add is going to be to entrepreneurs. And I think that is something that we've thought a lot about at True Wealth Ventures, of given the size of the team, our capabilities and expertise, where can we really play an impactful role? And where is it better for us to just, refer out, find an incredible consultant to partner with these startups? In terms of advice for people who are kind of navigating and figuring it out, both pieces are incredibly important for you to be a successful investor. I don't think you can be a successful investor if you don't understand the dynamics of a fund and how it works, or be able to roll up your sleeves and get your hands dirty and help a portfolio company with a financial model. You have to be able to do both because both are important and both are going to help drive your portfolio companies to grow and be stronger.
That sounds like a lot of work. And my thought process is there's some things you can obviously learn on the job. There's other things that you can learn on the job, but you're kind of expected to know from beforehand. So in your case, Abbie, like for example, the financial modeling piece, did you already have that expertise going into the VC space, or is that something you picked up? Because that's not a simple thing to figure out.
It is not simple. No, I learned it in the industry, and I'll add a plug for Zach, who taught me how. There's this incredible consultant. He's like a VC guru. His name's Zach. He's a partner at GV now, but he taught me financial modeling, and he does these cohorts with other associates. So once you're in the industry, I think there's a lot of this preconceived notions that you need this specific expertise and background to be successful in venture, like going to IB banking or, go study at Harvard or Stanford, which 40% of the industry has done. But I think that there's this, there is the skills, but I think the harder skills that you can't really teach is people. How do you deal with people? That kind of human interaction is so crucial to this industry. And a lot of it, I go to board meetings, I talk to a lot of our portfolio founders, and 90% of the problems that exist at a startup are communication problems.
Interesting.
And so that is a fundamental piece that you can't really learn on the job. You have to come in with that skill. But the rest of it, the financial modeling, kind of the tactical things, I'm like, those are learnable, or you can decide like, hey, this isn't my value add. This isn't where I can support and be an important aspect of the business to help grow it. So I think like kind of that self-awareness of recognizing where you should play and where you shouldn't is really important.
Yeah, and one thing that I think you're very good at, Abbie, is basically being a sponge and learning, taking on the additional responsibility, and really pushing the needle to help people that you're working with. And I think the way you've positioned it now, where there's a few tactical things that you can learn, maybe not, depending on how you want to, what's your value add, but then also learning to handle people. And I think it's a very underrated recommendation / advice, because I think most people don't realize the importance of good communication until they realize that's what's missing. And then it's you can't just read a book on communication. It takes time to build, years actually. And that's a great point. That's a great point. I was just talking to my uncle about this 2 weeks ago, so it really clicks in my mind.
Structured thinking. Barbara Mento has this like guiding principle book. She was kind of one of the first like senior women at McKinsey, and has this incredible book that you can buy. And she just kind of teaches what is now like the McKinsey principle of just how do you structure your thoughts in a way that people will understand, which like written communication is like a whole can of worms, but then there's also like that emotional intelligence piece too, of like how do you know when to push a founder when they still have more to give, or how do you know when you need to back off and give them time to process? Like so much of this is just dynamics and personalities. I mean, you look at an average board, well, who's on the board? People. At the end of the day, it's all people focused.
One of the VCs that I know who's raising a vertical SaaS fund out of Austin, Nick Tipman, he recommended a book to me called What They Don't Teach You at Harvard. So I bought the book, read one chapter. The entire theme of the book, Abbie, is literally EQ, right? Like knowing how to read the room, knowing how to judge a person based on how they play golf. Not literally all the time, but it's these little things that you have to pick up to really understand how a person thinks about whether they're generous, why they should be this, why they shouldn't be that, right? And I was able to marry a few of those components to things I've had to learn in my life. But that's a story for another time.
Venture it's dating, right? Like they're long-term relationships. Your average commitment is like 10 years. You're looking at a 10-year long relationship, right? So a lot of it is figuring out like, okay, who do I want to hang out with and know and call for 10 years? So like getting to the point quickly is really important. A quick no is really a blessing.
I see that with VCs and founders, and also the other relationships that you have to build out, I guess, when you're working at a VC fund. And which brings us to what you're doing at True Wealth. So I like True Wealth for many reasons. Don't want to spoil the surprise, but tell us, Abbie, a little bit about what True Wealth does, the kinds of founders and entrepreneurs that you invest in at True Wealth Ventures. And later on, we'll dig into the platform functions and or how you support your founders today.
Awesome. So as I mentioned earlier, so we do seed stage investing in women-led companies in the human and environmental health space. So that's kind of broader niche depending on where you come from. And I think a big part of kind of our differentiation as a firm is we're women-led. Our two GPs are women. They've been in this industry for 20 plus years. And I think that there's this inherent kind of trust and understanding that gets built when you're looking across the room between with a founder and an investor, where they just get you, where they just understand you, they look like you. And that representation matters. We talk a lot about that in venture and how, it hasn't been quite reflected. But just being able to show up to a meeting and talk about menstrual blood or pregnancy or birth and labor and delivery, and not feel the need to explain what that is, what that feels like, and kind of justify the product, service, or solution that you're building, I think is incredibly powerful. I'm able to dig into the nuts and bolts of the business, while a lot of what I hear from a lot of our founders is, well, we have to explain so much just to get an investor to understand the market opportunity here. Especially in women's health, because these, and to their credit, they don't know. You'd have to sell me really hard on an erectile dysfunction medication because I don't know that experience, right? But in women's health, and especially for women tend to solve problems that they experience in their lives, right? Making 80% of consumer purchase decisions, 85% of healthcare decisions. So a lot of those founders are solving problems that are really specialized to things that other women experience or that women will have the largest influence on. And so I think, for us as a firm, being able to have that connection pretty quickly is really critical to us being able to be a value add and to really get into the business. And then after investment, we've been in the industry for a while. Our 2 GPs are based in Austin, which I think is also incredibly cool because there's this whole ecosystem outside of San Francisco and New York that is thriving and that has a lot of capital and a lot of really cool innovation and scrappy founders, right? Like in Silicon Valley, I feel like the big hoo-ha of it all is like, well, how much did you raise? And I feel like in the Midwest, it's like, what did you build? And so there is some of that like tension of just, capital is abundant in the Bay and in New York, and it's not in other places, which again puts those fundamentals less on the headlines, less on the personality of the founder, and more around what is the business, right? How are we making money? How are we building solutions and services which are really going to benefit and have a large-scale impact on the communities that we're trying to serve?
There's a lot of great points in what you just said. And, going back to the first point with representation, it's not something, being very candid with you, Abbie, it's not something that clicked with me until I listened to the All In pod. And, Chamat's the only brown dude on the pod. I love every member of the pod, but then there's Chamat. I see him, a part of me actually gets excited thinking, oh, this dude started from, they had to, I believe, come from another country, and then he was working at Burger King, and now he's literally a VC, right? But he didn't become that because of luck only, like he put in a lot of hard work. And I see that, and even over a video, seeing him talk about political topics or startups, etc., gets me excited. So I can only imagine how much more powerful it might feel for a female entrepreneur who's been putting in her blood, sweat, and tears and building a company, and she gets into a room with VCs like the ones at your True Wealth Ventures, and they just get it because they have felt the same problems, they understand it, and they don't need that additional 20-30 minute dialogue to give them the context, right? It's really cool.
And then there's also like those, I think there's a lot of, as we've seen and it's been reported on, there's a lot of just kind of like bullshit questions that women get asked that men would never. Right. So like, how do you have kids? How are you growing a business with children? And so there are like those tensions, right? Where if you don't have to explain it, if you don't have to justify like what you're doing and why, you can really get to the root of the business, which again, like we're venture capitalists. We are investing in the business like that. We're here for profits and return, not kind of the bullshit like, oh, how does this work?
That's fascinating. Again, I didn't know that. Wow, lots of learning points for myself and the audience, so thank you for that, Abbie. Let's jump into the core of the questions that I want to ask you today around platform, right? Platform's been under fire recently. From my understanding, startups want to always cut marketing whenever there's a decline in economic conditions, etc. And I imagine in platform it's kind of the same. And correct me if I'm wrong, where what's our real value add? What are our services that founders have used versus not used? What are these 7 other services they haven't used it in the last 6 months? Do we really need to spend that 5-6 figures? Let's just get rid of it and realign our incentives there, right? Or realign our finances. So talk to me, Abbie, about how you see or how you've seen platform evolve over the last 3 to 5 years. And then would be very curious to learn about how you're supporting entrepreneurs within the True Wealth Ventures ecosystem as well.
Yeah. So I think like in general, like VC exploded in the last 2 years, right? Like we look at the 2020, 21 numbers and like things just got insane. Like capital was cheap, fund sizes were massively large, and from the VC's perspective, your management fees and revenue is fixed. You're getting 2% of your AUM, and then it's a step down depending on where you are in your fund cycle. And so I think that when capital was abundant, there was this strong emphasis on, okay, well, what additional non-investment support, like what does that look like at a firm? And that also helps from the firm's perspective, like that's your differentiation. If a founder's trying to decide between 2 term sheets And one firm has, take like an A16, has like this whole marketing support engine and like all these other, fractional CFOs, all these add-on services, and the other firm doesn't. Well, as a startup, you might be more inclined to go for the full wraparound support and services. But I think something that has happened, in 2023 in a less free capital constrained environment, higher interest rates, people are starting to question, well, is that really the value add? Like, are we tracking this? Are people using it? And I think that those are important questions. And I think that, if you're trying to offer platform services, you have to be really intentional about the why. Like, who are you offering these for? Is there consistent demand? And does this work for your investment strategy and your portfolio? I mean, if you're a generalist, it might not make sense to have a marketing person because the marketing needs of your entire portfolio are going to be so different. But if you're a healthcare investor investing in hardware and med devices, well, a specialized marketing person who deeply understands how to sell into healthcare systems, that's incredibly valuable. So I think a lot of it is figuring out, like, as a firm, given our investment strategy and given all the other things that we're doing, A, can we afford this? And B, like, what does success look like? And how are we going to measure and track this over time to ensure that it's valuable to us as a firm? Does this lead to increased valuations, extra rounds, maybe earlier acquisitions, faster contracts than industry average, especially in healthcare? Or is it just this nice to have thing that like markets really well that we like to talk about? And so I think, the industry didn't have a lot of discipline around it historically, and now we're starting to see like, okay, actually maybe we should track this and make sure that this is actually valuable.
That makes a lot of sense, especially the first piece, which again, just slowly clicking in my mind now, is aligning it to the actual needs of the startups. Having, if you're like you said, generalist team, does it make sense of a marketing person? But if you're a healthcare VC, having a person, fractional or not, to kind of come in and talk to founders around how they can sell into the healthcare business, like that has astronomically higher value than just having a service that's a nice to have. Great point there. And it also makes sense because I did see, forget what the company is, but I did see a few graphs from 2 to 3 years ago where all the graphs were up. Lots of money, lots of gunpowder ready to be deployed, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas now everyone's being very, not stingy, that's not the right word, but everyone's being hyper careful. So it makes sense that it automatically extends to the platform capabilities as well. And speaking of platform, for the founders within the True Wealth ecosystem, would you say that there's one or two things that you believe you excel at in helping founders get better direction at, for example, fundraising, anything of that sort?
Yeah, I think fundraising is kind of our specialty in terms of support, just given time in, VC is very much a how many years in, you build up, knowledge accumulates over time and it compounds. And same thing with network, right? The more investors the more resources you're going to have so that when your portfolio company is ready to raise their Series A, you can go to your CRM and download a report of, okay, who's everybody I know who invests in Series A and is interested in, say, environmental solutions. And then you go through that list again and can math out the average check size because, again, we all do intro calls. We all know what other firms are up to. Like that's, probably 10%, 15% of my time is just doing intro calls with people at other firms and building those relationships to send deals to. Yep. And so you're able to kind of cultivate that on behalf of your portfolio, and whether that's for existing ones with their future rounds or filling out investor syndicates, for a deal I did in the maternal health space earlier this year, I talked to everybody who came on the cap table, which was like obscene. But it was, again, like I think stingy is the correct word for investors. I think investors are two things, and that is cheap and that is lazy. And they are lazy in the sense of you have to show them, you can't tell them. And they are cheap in terms of like they will always go for the lowest number, right? We don't pay for conferences. We hate increased valuations if we're writing the term sheet. Like we're constantly aware of those things because at the end of the day, the math has to work, right? And the better deal you get coming in, the better your ROI is going to be on the outside.
That makes sense. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I guess, maybe zooming out a little bit, given that you've worked at emerging funds quite a lot, what are some recommendations, Abbie, from your side that you think can help fund managers better support their portfolio? Just primarily focusing on emerging funds and smaller funds or smaller VC teams, perhaps. What are some things they can do differently to better understand what their founders need and supporting them in the long run through their journey of building a unicorn or a big company?
I think a big one is just encouraging founders to ask questions about the firm. Like, as we're doing diligence on companies, I don't think enough founders do diligence on the firms. And I think a lot of that might stem from a lot of founders just don't know how funds work. And I think that that's really important. I frequently talk to all of my portfolio companies and give them the overview and the spiel of well, this is our incentive structure. This is how we make money. This is what we're looking for. This is how we think about portfolio construction. This is how much we're reserving for follow-ons. At what rounds, at what pace. This is where we are in our investment deployment schedule. This is when we're going to raise our next fund. Kind of some of those fundamentals on how does the fund operate, I think is so undervalued and under-knowledged across the industry. And for founders, you need to know those things because these people are on your cap table and they're going to be on your cap table for a long time. And if their incentive, you need to know what their incentives are looking like in the long term. And, say they're on Fund 3 and haven't had any returns yet, well, they're going to probably be pressuring you a lot more to get an earlier exit, right? So, understanding kind of where firms are coming from and how they operate internally, I think is incredibly valuable. And not enough people ask those questions. In every email I send to a founder with our questions, I say, and please let me know if you have any questions for us. And nobody ever sends me anything.
That's kind of interesting, Abbie. The book that I'm reading right now is called Secrets of Sand Road. It's written by, I don't know if it's a GP, but he was or is a partner at Andreessen Horowitz. And he talks about literally what you just said, right? Understanding the incentives of a fund and how LPs work, what the relationship is, what's a carry. And I'm very, very happy you mentioned the word pressured, right? If they haven't had an exit in a long, long time, or if their fund's in their 7th or 8th year, and most of the companies they invested in aren't really doing too well, how do you think the relationship with you, now that they're investing in you as a startup, will go? And it's not because they're tough people or bad people. It's just the money, it's just the business, it's just how things work. And if you don't, as a founder, understand these incentives from the get-go, there will be miscommunication down the line, right? And hearing you say that, working in VC, just resonates very well with me. So that's a great, great point that you brought up. And I think, Abbie, I'm a founder, right? I think the reason some founders are a bit hesitant to ask questions, because I think it's a bit intimidating, right? When you're talking to the person or an entity who can give you funding, and if you really, really, really need that funding to stay afloat, I think personally, very candidly, one anxiety that I would have is, well, I don't want to ask too many questions and come off as too arrogant, or I don't want to come off as, ask too many questions and, unsettle something. I just want things to go smoothly. And I think that that anxiety would stop me from asking any questions at all personally. That's what I think.
I think that happens all the time. Yeah. But I want to challenge people of how many questions am I asking you? Mm-hmm. The power, I hear you on the power dynamic. It can be uncomfortable, right? I have money, you need money, you want the money that I have. That creates this weird dynamic already from the get-go. But again, these are partnerships. And if you don't have that, if you can't get comfortable doing that, well, how on earth are you going to be able to call up this investor when shit hits the fan? When things are not going well, right? The whole point of investors and VCs, that's your phone call. You're in jail, who's the one person you call? That's supposed to be your investor, right? I'm here to help you. Your success, your wins and failures are my wins and failures. And so I think setting that precedent from the get-go, and obviously VCs have to kind of lead the tone of that. I'm sure some of them would not be responsive if people started asking questions. But honestly, if an investor pushes back on basic questions just about how they're running their organization and where they're at on their fund cycle and things like that, well, then that's probably not a partner you want on your cap table for 10 years.
Yeah, it's almost like reverse due diligence.
A little, I mean, it should. Diligence goes both ways, and I don't think that is nearly as common in the industry as it should be, right? Like only a handful of companies that I've ever talked to have asked to talk to other portfolio company founders.
I was going to say this earlier, is that, one thing, if I was raising, what I would do is I would first of all try, so, the rule of running a network or building a happy, good network is to kind of double check a person's reputation with other people that they supposedly know, or have worked with in the past. And so that applies to, if I was a founder, I would talk to the partners of the VCs, and I would again do that mathematics to see, okay, someone knows Abbie, let me talk to that someone and see how Abbie, what her vibe is. Is she pushy? Does she give space? Does she help ask questions? What do people say about Abbie? But then I would take it a step further, and I would 100% talk to the other portfolio companies, especially the ones who raise in a similar climate, or B, are in the same kind of industry and or have the same team formations. I don't want to talk to a startup with 50 people if I'm just 3 people. I want to talk to startups that have less than 5 or 7 people, because they understand my pains, and we're probably on the same wavelength in terms of challenges, issues, and runway even, I'm not sure. I personally learned a lot from not just around your industry and, how you work with founders, etc., but how you consolidated everything. And, there was a lot of bullet points as well as a lot of connecting factors across all of these. How do you want to close up the pod? I know you have a lot of wisdom to share, but if there was one thing that you could close off the pod with, what would that be?
I think it's that, the capital and VC as an industry at large is desperate for new perspectives, right? We've seen historically the same people who give money funding people who look like them, funding problems that exist within those communities. And there's this entire untapped market of historically underrepresented founders and problem solvers that has yet to be determined, right? So I think if you have a perspective or a worldview that you think is unique and differentiated, well, think about investing. Think about getting involved in the VC ecosystem. Think about starting a company, because we're desperate for those types of solutions, and there's a lot of unmet potential and need in those segments.
That's awesome. And if any of the listeners want to get in touch with Abbie, I'll include her details in the chat below, so you can add her on LinkedIn and have a wonderful conversation. Abbie, this was super fun. I'm very happy you're our first guest on the pod, and thank you so much for coming on.
Me too. This was loads of fun. Always happy to chat.
Alrighty. Thank you. Bye now.